small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Noah's Search, Probing Satellite Imagery for Lost Ark. Moviegoers will recently treat to Noah, an epic story of bravery and sacrifice from the Old Testament, a saga in which the titular character takes on the divine mission to build an ark to save creation from an apocalyptic deluge. Outside the big screen, speculation has swirled for decades that the leftovers of Noah's Ark hug the heights of Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey at a spot known as the Ararat Anomaly. In true detective jargon, call it an anomaly of interest. Satellite imagery and analysis may make it possible to resolve the mystery. Portia Taylor, a professor of paralegal studies in the School of Professional and Continuing Studies at the University of Richmond, has led the search into the Mount Ararat anomaly. Taylor's quest began long ago, he said. The cognitive genesis of my journey began in 1973, some 41 years ago, in my junior year as a cadet at West Point, he told Space.com. Back then, Taylor came across credible rumors, ricocheting off the walls of the academy that a CIA spy satellite had accidentally imaged what appeared to be the bow of a ship sticking up out of the ice cap on Mount Ararat, Taylor said. A couple of decades later, Taylor launched his own satellite declassification initiative investigating the Mount Ararat anomaly imagery. Drawing on his 21 years of armchair sleuthing, Taylor has given unclassified presentations at the Pentagon and the U.S. Naval Surface Warfare Center. Along the way, he declared victory in convincing the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1995 to declassify 5 1949 U.S. Air Force aerial photos of Mount Ararat. Additionally, thanks to Taylor's invitations, a number of experts over the years have performed analyses of the satellite imagery, which thankfully tempered my zeal as an amateur, Taylor said. So in this day and age, why continue the journey? The wealth of information provided by Digital Globe's satellite imagery keeps Taylor going, he said. My ultimate goal has always been that my acquisition over the years of progressively higher and higher resolution satellite imagery from Digital Globe of the anomaly might definitively change the anomaly into a known entity, either something geological or perhaps something of biblical proportions, Taylor said. Digital Globe's new and powerful WorldView 3 spacecraft is slated for launch from California's Vandenberg Air Force Base in summer 2014. Among its customer-provided attributes, the satellite will yield 31 cm, 12 inches, panchromatic resolution, making it the highest resolution commercial satellite in the world. Digital Globe's constellation of satellites would be the envy of Indiana Jones, Taylor told Space.com. I'm grateful and humbled that Digital Globe has flown numerous gratis missions for me over Mt Ararat over the past decade, especially the QuickBird satellite mission of February 2003 that captured the boat-like form of the anomaly at 15,000 feet, without excessive amounts of snow and ice cover. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. You can visit us on www.therealthingme.webs.com.
We're talking this morning about a subject that has been very close to my heart and a project that I've been involved in for over 20 years now. And you'll see some of the culmination of that has come to a head just literally in the last few days. It's obviously been one of the atheists' favorite objects of ridicule. How in the world could you get all those animals on that little bitty boat? The story of the world being destroyed by a flood is a fairy tale. It's absurd. It's not possible. And we meet this constantly. But we want to emphasize first this morning that this is a real and a true story. To give you an idea of the attitude that prevails, consider the statement by Professor William Powell that occurred in the Dallas Morning News not long ago. There were reports, false reports at the time, of the sighting of Noah's Ark. And he was interviewed, asked what he thought about that. He said, Noah's Ark will be discovered about the same time as Jack's beanstalk is found. He's a professor at SMU, Southern Methodist University, and I've indicated that they have about as much faith in God's Word as they do in Mother Goose several times, and he pretty well documented that. He says the whole notion of building in a week a boat big enough to hold and at the same time collecting two of every kind of animals is a formidable task. Of course, he doesn't believe a word of it. He thinks it took a week to build the ark. Evidently confused it with the creation week. Great scholar. And thought Noah had to collect all the animals. He obviously is not a man of faith, but that's typical. How can you believe in Jesus and disbelieve in the stories that Jesus obviously believed? How can you have faith in Christ and not what he said? The coming of the Son of Man, Matthew 24, Jesus says, will be just like the days of Noah. Oh, but that's a myth. Well, what does that say about the coming of the Son of Man? They laughed, of course, in the days of Noah, and they still laugh today. Peter responded to the skeptics who were saying all things continue as they were since the fathers fell asleep. God's not going to judge. They deliberately suppress this fact, according to the New International Translation. The world existing at that time was destroyed when it was deluged with water. Peter thought this was real, and so did Jesus. And I don't think you can believe the New Testament without believing the story of the flood. We not only have to show that the flood was real. Many will say, well, yes, I believe in the flood, but it was a local flood. Filled the Mesopotamian Valley, Black Sea overflowed. That's not what the Bible is telling us. There is abundant evidence in the physical realm as well as from Scripture for a global flood. Let's consider Punkin Wagnall's statement under the heading of deluge or flood, defined excuse me, by them as a world cataclysm during which the world was inundated or submerged by water, a concept found in almost every mythology in the world. Okay, they think it's a myth, but my question is, how did it get in every mythology in the world? Who told everybody? A more reasonable explanation is this was a common event in their histories. We see flood traditions from all over the world. They say traditions. 59 different stories from North America, the core being true, variations in details. Central and South America, there are 46, 31 from Europe, 17 from the Middle East, 23 from Asia, and 37 from the Pacific Islands and Australia. I was in the outback in Australia and bought a boomerang from one of the artisans there and asked about the carvings. This is the story of the flood. that destroyed the world and the 8 people that were saved. Different names, but same basic story all over the world. And of course, there are lots of floods in the outback in Australia. Genesis describes the flood with at least 30 universal terms, like the water prevailed more and more upon the earth so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Verse 21, all flesh that moves on the earth perished. Every swarming thing. These are the terms that are used to describe what happened, all mankind. Notice the qualifying factor on the earth, not in the ocean. You don't have to have fish on the ark. But things on the earth were destroyed. Every living thing upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things, birds of the sky, were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left together with those with him in the ark. And of course, if it was the Mesopotamian Valley and one bird flew over the hill, then this isn't true. And why wouldn't they? And why would you need an ark in the first place? Just go over the hill. It makes nonsense of the story. How many people were there with Noah? I mean, in the world at the time? Well, a few thousand in the Mesopotamian Valley. I think population dynamics provide one of the most powerful arguments for the young earth, as well as giving us insight into how many were killed. And the judgment. God won't judge that many. Well, think about the population for a moment. We look at the CIA World Factbook from 2009. It tells us the growth rate of the population in America is just barely over 1%. Third world countries, of course, some of them over 4%. But let's do some calculations, beginning with 8 people with a growth rate of 0.6. That's less than half. That's as small as we're told you can get it without something going extinct. And then multiply it times the 4,500 years that have transpired since the flood. How many people would you have since the flood? 7 billion. How many we got today? 7 billion. That works out pretty well. Now that's as small a growth rate as you can have. Well, let's compare that with the evolutionist approach, starting with 2 people. Now that's not exactly their approach, but anyway, using the same growth rate with just 200,000 years. That's a minimal figure for the length of time man's been on the earth, at least half a million. How many people? 10 to the 398th. Now, maybe you're not a mathematician, but I'll just tell you, that's super silly. You compare that with electrons in the galaxy, they're 10 to the 65th. Or in the universe, 10 to the 80th, and you got 10 to the 398th. This is absurd. This one is right on. Now, we look at before the flood, 2,500 years instead of 45, but they lived longer and they had more children. I think there were comparable numbers before the flood. Billions. Genesis 6 says the earth was filled with violence. Doesn't sound like Mesopotamian Valley, does it? And you compare with Genesis chapter 9, which is one of the, I think, most obvious arguments against the idea of the local flood, where God promised with the covenant of the rainbow, never again shall I bring a flood to destroy the earth. And, of course, there never has been a local flood since then, has there? If he's talking about a local flood, he was lying. And he wasn't. Never again will he bring this universal flood. Seashells on mountaintops. Of course, I know how the geologists explain that, and it doesn't work. but has long been recognized as evidence for the flood, beginning, for example, with Eusebius back in 325 AD. Here's confirmation of the flood. You got fossils on top of Mount Lebanon. And I've documented seashells on mountaintops from all over the world. These are from my collection here in Bolivia, 14,000 feet. The trilobites lived at the bottom of the ocean on seashells. This is Mount Nebo, from which Moses surveyed the promised land, seashells all over the place up there. And then more here on Mount Everest, the highest peak in the world. Guess what you got on top of Mount Everest? Seashells. Described as the highest fossils in the world. Well, I guess so. That's the highest mountain in the world. That's pretty obvious. Mt Ararat, where we have spent a good bit of time of late, I have collected these fossils, which would indicate that there's been a flood here. Well, certainly been water there. Now, they're not up at the top. Most of it's volcanic, but above 8,000 feet. Pillar lava, many people wouldn't understand, but notice Wikipedia's description, and if Wikipedia says it, you know it has to be true. It's big tongue-in-cheek here. Pillar lava is typically formed when lava emerges from an underwater volcanic vent, or lava that flows into the ocean. This has to be underwater. Now here the lava forms into the shape of a big pillar, as you can see, and this is a whole field of it, and it's at over 8,000 feet, well over a mile up there at the base of Mount Ararat. You like that picture? And notice particularly the one over here in the center on the right. You see the interior of the pillar, the concentric circles. This is better than the pictures you see in the textbooks of pillar lava. And then on up the mountain, here we are at 12,000 feet, and that's a whole field behind me of pillar lava. And that's as good or better than what you find in the textbooks, and that formed underwater at over 2 miles up on Mount Ararat. 2 mile high local flood. It's a little hard to imagine, isn't it? It was real and it was global. But how in the world do you get all the animals on that little bitty boat? This just is not, it couldn't be a real story. Well, how many animals? How big was the boat? Well, I don't know, but you couldn't do that. Ernst Mayr is one of the leading skeptics from Harvard. He says there are at least 1 million species on the earth today. If you add the billions from millions of years in the past, it would be more, but today you got this many. What's wrong with this estimate? You don't have to have fish on the ark, do you? Or arthropods or sponges, they live in the ocean. Almost all of that is in the ocean. You've got mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians, many of them on there, but many of them live in the ocean. The sea turtles and the whales and porpoise and so forth are mammals. But we're looking then at 17,000, which is a very different figure, but we're looking at land animals here, and we're looking at species, not kinds. And you compare the way that's used in the Old Testament, they're not equivalent. But let's use species, which would multiply the figure considerably. For the calculations, times 2, there were 2 of each. There were more of the clean, 7 of the clean, but there are very few of the clean, relatively speaking. We would also double for extinction, add 5,000 for the clean, for a total of about 75,000 maximum. That's way more clean animals than would be involved, and doubling for extinction is just being as generous as we can be, using species. If you go at it more reasonably, you've got probably more like 5,000 kinds, and many have estimated about half of that figure. Give you 10,000, double that for extinction, and then add 1,000 clean, a more reasonable figure, so something like 21. 25,000 maximum. Well, do you have room for that on the ark? Well, not if you're looking at this kind of a vessel, which many people think of. It's more like this kind of a vessel, about 2 football fields long, the height of a 5-story building, and yes, we got dinosaurs going up the gangplank. That's one of the questions we always get, were there dinosaurs on the ark? I think we can prove that, and we'll see that later in the week, but wouldn't have had to be great-grandpas, which I think represented the Seismosaurus. Reptiles continue to grow all their life, unlike mammals. They don't stop, and I think those are the great-great-grandpas, but the teenagers would reproduce better in what God would choose. We do find dragons all the way through the Bible, well over a dozen times mentioned in the King James, plus the behemoth and the leviathan, which certainly sound like dinosaurs. And you look at some of the dinosaurs, that some of the ones this one discovered fairly recently, sure looks like a dragon to me. In fact, it's called Dracorex hogwartia, recognized by you Harry Potter fans as the dragon. I think they're talking about dinosaurs. Shakespeare, of course, knew all about the dragons and spoke of them rather matter-of-factly. How big was the ark? You got to know how big the ark was to know if there's enough room. How big was the cubit? Well, I think, we find all the way from 18 to 36 inches, but we have good reason to believe it was 21 inches, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. That would make it almost 2 football fields long, over 50 feet high, the height of a 5-story building, and twice the football field. Well over 2 million cubic feet, which everybody understands, right? 2 million, that calculates. Not with most, but if we compare that to railroad cars, it's the equivalent of about 750 railroad cars. And if you got stopped by a train on the way to services this morning with this kind of a train, you'd still be there. There never has been a train that long. Couldn't be. How many animals can you get on the car? Well, you have to know what the average size animal was. We think of horses and cows, but the average is actually the size of a cat. Many more shrews, mice, than the bigger animals. Well, you don't ship cats across the country in railroad cars too often, but you do with sheep. That's considerably more than twice the size. But using that for calculation, the standard is 240 per railroad car, double-deck railroad car. What you typically see in trains today, that would be the equivalent of 180,000 animals. Well, how many did we have to account for? Using species instead of kind, the splitters, not the lumpers estimate, multiplying the number, doubling for extinction, doubling the average size, we got 75,000 maximum that we had to come up with, yet we've got a capacity for 180,000. Where's the problem? You've got all of them accommodated in 42% of the ark's capacity, so you could spread them out a little bit. In fact, if you use the estimate with kinds instead of species, you've got all of it accommodated in 12% of the ark's capacity using the standard spacing for twice the size of average that's used for shipping sheep across the country. Or you could have all the animals easily on the bottom deck, have the food on the second deck and just drop it down to them, and have the top deck from Mr. and Ms. Noah family all by themselves. In fact, you could have a regulation-sized football field up on the top deck and still have all the animals up to watch. Where's the problem? We're the one that needs to be doing the ridiculing. They say you couldn't get all the animals. Well, how big is the ark? Well, they don't know, but you couldn't get all the animals on it. Well, how many animals? I don't know, but you put the pencil to it, and there's not a problem. These are conservative figures. There have been some very inventive, ingenious objections that have been raised against the ark. John Woodmarappy is a friend of mine who has researched this for the past 20 years. He's got all of the objections that have been made for the past 100 years by atheists in this book and then the answers to them. So this is a lot more than you want to know about answers to objections, and I would recommend the book if you have a question. Which brings us to the question, is it possible that the ark could still be on Mount Ararat? Of course, nobody's really interested in that, are they? I think so. That's a different question. And a lot of people are interested in, they found it on Mars, they found it under Saddam's palace. The devil knows how to put out counterfeits to camouflage. But it's not the same question as, was it true? Is it still there? Is not necessarily relevant to that first question. But if it is still there, then obviously it was true. We're talking about Turkey, eastern Turkey, according to Scripture, though there's some question if that is definitive in the Old Testament when it mentions the mountains of Ararat. The largest of two mountains, named Ararat, is in eastern Turkey, side by side, Greater and Lesser Ararat. And it's just below the former Soviet bloc, 6 miles from Iran, about 100 miles from Iraq, in eastern Turkey, where there's been a war going on for the past 20 years. Not a very nice place. The Kurds have killed about 40,000 people in their separatist cause. They think this is Kurdistan. Turkey doesn't agree, and they're fighting about it. Wish we had more to say, but time to say about that, but we'll pass over. I'm standing here with my back to the border of Iran, and I step forward about 50 yards and take this picture of Mount Ararat, which will give you an idea of the proximity and the location of the mountain and some of the difficulties involved. When we go back to ancient writings, it doesn't seem to be an issue. Many historians speak of the ark still being there and being witnessed and described. We find the Sumerian king list mentions it in detail. The Gilgamesh epic does, as well as the Atrahasis epic, Babylonian flood account, all matter-of-factly. Josephus says all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of the flood and of this ark. Anybody that's not a Jew, of course, is a barbarian in his view. But they all do, and he mentions specifically about a half a dozen. He says the land also possesses the remains of the ark, remains which to this day are shown to those who are curious to see them. That was the case in the first century, but we see those accounts and descriptions declining and disappearing until 1840, when there was a huge earthquake on the mountain that opened a huge gash in the side, the Ahura Gorge, and evidently exposed it again, because from that point we have a number of eyewitness accounts, about 25 that appear to be credible, 4 especially, that are harmonious from totally different directions and cultures and people that harmonize. Beginning with George Hagopian, who was an eyewitness in 1904. He was one of the Armenians that lived at the base of the mountain. His family was exterminated, along with about 3 million Armenians, by the Bolshevik Revolution. He, along with a few others, were able to flee to America. He heard a lecture on the ark, went up to the lecturer and said, "I've seen it." And then with Alfred Lee, worked to help produce these paintings, pictures of what he had seen. Nothing like the old master paintings. The single window across the top, finished a cubit and a half upward, as King James Version tells us, seems to fit. Not designed to go anywhere, but to carry things would work. This is another view. That year, or the 2 years that he went, are two of the hottest on record, with the smallest amount of precipitation the winter before. All correlates. He passed away in 78. There are at least 4 other accounts that we don't have time to go into in detail. George Green, Artumov, a Russian general who was dispatched along with 50 soldiers up just before the Bolshevik Revolution to photograph as a result of Russian aviators having seen it. While they were on the mountain, the revolution took place, the Tsar was killed, virtually all of the clerics, and they came down the mountain 2 months later with pictures of the Ark. Most of them were killed. Artumov escaped to America, to Oklahoma City, and this is a sketch of the photograph that he had. Much more to that story, interesting, but we'll pass. Green was a petroleum geologist flying over in '54 with a helicopter, photographed this vessel sticking out of the glacier. Wasn't looking for the Ark, wasn't a religious person at all, came home, showed it to people. They asked what mountain, he said Mount Ararat. They said, well, look what you got a picture of. He was then killed for those pictures down in South America. Ed Davis was with the Army Corps of Engineers during World War II. I've interviewed him together with Don Shockey, who's climbed the mountain 5 times. He describes details that demonstrate he had to be there without question. And he's describing exactly what Hagopian and Davis and Artumov are describing. Again, together with Alfred Lee, produced a picture of what he saw. By the time he saw it in '43, it was broken into the 2 pieces that we see here. But he was able to get within about 75 yards and then examine it with Army field glasses. He saved the life of the son of one of the chieftain, grandson of one of the village chieftains, and as a reward they adopted him into the Kurdish tribe and carried him up at the end of the summer to show him the Ark as a part of the adoption ceremony. But it correlates with the other accounts. Ed Davis saw this in 1943. Since then, that's filled up with ice. Well, how does ice build up? Weren't we told it's all melting? Well, in some places it's melting, some places it's not. If you're familiar with the story of the Lost Squadron, a number of World War II airplanes abandoned in World War II in Greenland, they found them some 50 years later under 260 feet of ice that built up in 50 years. Of course, each one of the thousands of layers here took a year, and it all happened in 50 years. Maybe you can make sense of that. But the layers of ice is supposed to be one of the great evidences for the older Earth, and here we see thousands of them in 50 years. On top of Ararat, we see about 90 feet of ice from the bottom of the valley to the top. This is the spot that we're very interested in and that is most accessible. It's about 32 feet down. But it's under the ice. Dr. Randall Price, that we introduced in the lesson this morning, who is director of the project at Qumran, has worked with me there on Mount Ararat, together with Dr. John Bryant, PhD in geophysics. He has professional license as an engineer and a geologist and a geophysicist, and is also a cartographer. Nice fella to have on the team. He's worked with another individual that must remain nameless, who has provided information from a satellite that can see under the ice. And working together, we produced this picture from the satellite and have found that Ed Davis Valley, now full of ice, just below the summit. This is what the satellite sees at this really nice spot. This is 3.5 miles up. And it's not fun to get up there. Looking at a more detailed view, you can see the route that we've taken, climbing now 6 times in the last 5 years. That little white speck is the tent. Pretty good sized tent at about 10,000 feet. From there, we travel up forever, it seems, to 14,000 feet, and the little white specks there are the large camp tents there at that base camp. And that's not a really nice spot. Here's one of the Kurds that helped us there at that camp, giving thanks to Allah with the rainbow in the background. We look down from our, this is the comfy campsite, like some of you enjoy today. Looking down from that site, you can't see down, it's under the clouds. And then looking up from that site, you can't see that either, that's under the clouds. As you get up above the 14,000 base camp, you can barely see it, but this is not a fun trip. This is the route up. And those rocks tumble and roll when you step on them. I had one 2 years ago roll under my feet, and I wound up in the Turkish hospital. And you can almost see that stitching string from my head to the hand, and stitching up the gash. And I did get a very professional bandage out of that, though, as you can see, in a hospital full of flies that had lots of iodine. From 14,000, it's almost straight up there, finally up to 17,000 at the top. There's no air up there. You have to dodge the crevasse once you get up on the ice. They're often hidden. They look very safe at the top. At the bottom, it's certain death. This is a picture where one of our teammates fell through that ice bridge. He was fortunately roped together. We were roped together, and we caught him and pulled him back. You can see other crevasses up ahead. This is a spot that was proved to be very dangerous. It's just about 600 feet below the summit, where Tom Russell preaches in Dallas. We worked together for 4 years there, and I were stranded overnight in a whiteout. We were without parkas, tents, and sleeping bags, which had been carried on ahead of us, in sub-zero temperatures with 80 to 90 mile an hour winds. That's very lethal. There was some real providence involved in our surviving that night. But we did. This is not a fun trip. That's the summit. And at this point, you take about 50 steps and then pant, because there's no air there. We did make it to the top, over the top, and then down about an hour in the other direction. The summit was not the goal. The Ed Davis Valley was. And here we see the dig site about an hour past the summit. The first night, well, we began, of course, digging the hole where the satellite had indicated it. The first night we had over 80 mile per hour winds, and that's not a fun place to be in a tent. The next morning we had to dig out. This was Randall Price's tent. We almost found it. The next night it got bad. It did shred most of the tents that we had at that time. We had to double up in the tents. I rescued the director, Dick Bright, from this tent about 3 o'clock in the morning. He was under the snow and was almost gone. We stuffed him in a bag and didn't look too good the next morning. We did build a protective house out of plexiglass and steel that provided a refuge in some of the worst storms, and continued to dig. It was at that point 2 years ago that 14 of our teammates were captured by the rebel Kurds. They were all released but one, and he was executed. The following year, the satellite indicated that one of the pieces had broken. There was an earthquake, and so we were going for that site. Dr. Bryant, using side-scanning radar and electrical resistivity, was helping us locate this, and he pulled the sled. This is our alpinist who's been to the North Pole and climbed Everest, helping us survive. And with that grid, he was able then to analyze the data with the computer, send it back to his office in Dallas, and analyze it and spit out some pictures. We are confident we're very close. We appreciate your prayers in very dangerous circumstances. Let's think about some implications of this. If you got the ark 3.5 miles up, you don't have a local flood. Now, is that obvious? Can we grant that? A local flood becomes absurd at that point. Geologists tell us that this 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock that covers the continents with billions of dead things in it is a result of evolution over millions of years. We say, no, it's a result of a year's judgment that destroyed the world that then was and buried it. Which story is true? If we got a 3.5 mile high local flood, our flood, then I think we tilt the scales pretty heavily. This says worldwide judgment. Gilbert Grosvenor was the first editor of National Geographic, very different from today. He says the discovery of Noah's Ark would be the greatest archaeological find in human history, the greatest event since the resurrection of Christ. It would alter all the currents of scientific thought. Biologists would have to realize it didn't begin millions of years ago. It began 4,500 years ago at the base of Mount Ararat. That's a different story. Zoologists, historians, the professor at SMU with his religious book has to start over. Very interesting comment recently from Tom Jarrell, who was commenting on the possibility. He said, consider if the biblical story of creation is fact and not fable, then the theory of evolution is all wet. A confirmed story of Noah's Ark would be the greatest archaeological find of all times and would provide for religious fundamentalist hard evidence of the Bible's absolute reliability. Now, he's not a believer, but he understands the implications, and they're obvious. And I think he's absolutely right. And so I think we're on the verge of that which is very significant. Many would laugh and be skeptical as they were before. Peter says they deliberately ignore the fact. But it is a fact. The water was deluged and perished. Jesus says they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. It's not a picture of a little boat on top of the water. The real story is under the water. And it's not a pretty picture. It's a picture of judgment of billions of people. And so will the coming of the Son of Man be, Jesus tells us. Peter says the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, the earth and its works will be burned up. Then by fire, it's coming, that is, then by water, now by fire. The writer of the book of Hebrews refers to this and says the judgment is not the only part of the picture. He prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. That's what God intended and wanted and pled with for 120 years. He's pleading today. He doesn't want you to be destroyed as the billions were in the flood. But he will judge. And people can imagine he won't. But we have proof that he did and that he will. But he mercifully offers salvation to all through the ark of safety in the body of Christ and through the blood of Christ. You're here this morning and haven't rendered obedience to the gospel. Please respond while you have time and opportunity. While God's mercy is extended. Come confessing your faith, repent of your sins, be baptized into Christ. If you've wandered away, come back while we stand and sing.
NOAA's search, probing satellite imagery for lost Ark. Moviegoers will recently treat it to Noah, an epic story of bravery and sacrifice from the Old Testament, a saga in which the titular character takes on the divine mission to build an ark to save creation from an apocalyptic deluge. Outside the big screen, speculation has swirled for decades that the leftovers of Noah's Ark hugged the heights of Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey at a spot known as the Ararat anomaly. In true detective jargon, call it an anomaly of interest. Satellite imagery and analysis may make it possible to resolve the mystery. Portia Taylor, a professor of paralegal studies in the School of Professional and Continuing Studies at the University of Richmond, has led the search into the Mt Ararat anomaly. Taylor's quest began long ago, he said. The cognitive genesis of my journey began in 1973, some 41 years ago, in my junior year as a cadet at West Point, he told Space.com. Back then, Taylor came across credible rumors, ricocheting off the walls of the academy that a CIA spy satellite had accidentally imaged what appeared to be the bow of a ship sticking up out of the ice cap on Mount Ararat, Taylor said. A couple of decades later, Taylor launched his own satellite declassification initiative investigating the Mount Ararat anomaly imagery. Drawing on his 21 years of armchair sleuthing, Taylor has given unclassified presentations at the Pentagon and the U.S. Naval Surface Warfare Center. Along the way, he declared victory in convincing the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1995 to declassify 5 1949 U.S. Air Force aerial photos of Mount Ararat. Additionally, thanks to Taylor's invitations, a number of experts over the years have performed analyses of the satellite imagery, which thankfully tempered my zeal as an amateur, Taylor said. So in this day and age, why continue the journey? The wealth of information provided by Digital Globe's satellite imagery keeps Taylor going, he said. My ultimate goal has always been that my acquisition over the years of progressively higher and higher resolution satellite imagery from Digital Globe of the anomaly might definitively change the anomaly into a known entity, either something geological or perhaps something of biblical proportions, Taylor said. Digital Globe's new and powerful WorldView 3 spacecraft is slated for launch from California's Vandenberg Air Force Base in summer 2014. Among its customer-provided attributes, the satellite will yield 31 cm, 12 inches, panchromatic resolution, making it the highest resolution commercial satellite in the world. Digital Globe's constellation of satellites would be the envy of Indiana Jones, Taylor told Space.com. I'm grateful and humbled that Digital Globe has flown numerous gratis missions for me over Mount Ararat over the past decade, especially the QuickBird satellite mission of February 2003 that captured the boat-like form of the anomaly at 15,000 feet, without excessive amounts of snow and ice cover. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. You can visit us on www.therealthingmeme.webs.com. NOAA's search, probing satellite imagery for lost Ark. Moviegoers will recently treat it to Noah, an epic story of bravery and sacrifice from the Old Testament, a saga in which the titular character takes on the divine mission to build an ark to save creation from an apocalyptic deluge. Outside the big screen, speculation has swirled for decades that the leftovers of Noah's Ark hugged the heights of Mt Ararat in eastern Turkey at a spot known as the Ararat anomaly. In true detective jargon, call it an anomaly of interest. Satellite imagery and analysis may make it possible to resolve the mystery. Portia Taylor, a professor of paralegal studies in the School of Professional and Continuing Studies at the University of Richmond, has led the search into the Mt Ararat anomaly. Taylor's quest began long ago, he said. The cognitive genesis of my journey began in 1973, Some 41 years ago, in my junior year as a cadet at West Point, he told Space.com. Back then, Taylor came across credible rumors, ricocheting off the walls of the academy that a CIA spy satellite had accidentally imaged what appeared to be the bow of a ship sticking up out of the ice cap on Mt Ararat, Taylor said. A couple of decades later, Taylor launched his own satellite declassification initiative investigating the Mt Ararat anomaly imagery. Drawing on his 21 years of armchair sleuthing, Taylor has given unclassified presentations at the Pentagon and the U.S. Naval Surface Warfare Center. Along the way, he declared victory in convincing the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1995 to declassify 5 1949 U.S. Air Force aerial photos of Mt Ararat. Additionally, thanks to Taylor's invitations, a number of experts over the years have performed analyses of the satellite imagery, which thankfully tempered my zeal as an amateur, Taylor said. So in this day and age, why continue the journey? The wealth of information provided by Digital Globe's satellite imagery keeps Taylor going, he said. My ultimate goal has always been that my acquisition over the years of progressively higher and higher resolution satellite imagery from Digital Globe of the anomaly might definitively change the anomaly into a known entity, either something geological or perhaps something of biblical proportions, Taylor said. Digital Globe's new and powerful WorldView 3 spacecraft is slated for launch from California's Vandenberg Air Force Base in summer 2014. Among its customer-provided attributes, the satellite will yield 31 cm, 12 inches, panchromatic resolution, making it the highest resolution commercial satellite in the world. Digital Globe's constellation of satellites would be the envy of Indiana Jones, Taylor told Space.com. I'm grateful and humbled that Digital Globe has flown numerous gratis missions for me over Mt Ararat over the past decade, especially the QuickBird satellite mission of February 2003 that captured the boat-like form of the anomaly at 15,000 feet, without excessive amounts of snow and ice cover.